Welcome to Talking Tactics, a show about insights and the results they ignite. I'm Safaniya Stevenson, a brand strategist and cultural analyst in the wonderful world of marketing. And every other week, I dig into the aha moments that changed everything for a higher education marketer. Each episode of Talking Tactics starts with an insight, following it from observation to action that created measurable results. We're talking about the breakthrough moments that happen with scrappy resources, and sometimes we'll even explore the tactics that, crash and burn, because there's also value in trial and error. Your next innovative idea might be hiding in your data, your hallway conversations, or your own gut instinct. So let's get to it. All right, folks, we're back with another exciting episode of Talking Tactics. And this time, we're actually going to be talking about Indigenous values and how you can tie those in to your enrollment strategies. And today, I am joined by Jana Hanson, Senior Director of Member and Student Services for the American Indian Higher Education Consortium, and Kata Traxler, Director of Postsecondary Strategy with Student Ready Strategies. Welcome to the show.
Thank you.
Thank you so much for having us.
Absolutely. So, Jana, let's go with you first. What is AIHEC? A lot of letters there. What is it?
We call it AIHEC, and that stands for the American Indian Higher Education Consortium. And it's a unified group of all the tribal colleges and universities in the United States. And they focus on cultivating student success and perpetuate the lifeways and sovereignty of tribal nations. And we also amplify the collective voices of tribal-led higher education to empower TCUs through policy, research, and capacity building.
Sweet. And tell us a little bit about Student Ready Strategies, Kata.
Sure. So Student Ready Strategies, we supply technical assistance to institutions in higher education, as well as different state organizations as well. So for us, we really believe that every student is college ready, and we believe that every institution can be student ready, and that we need to help them to ensure that they are. So technical support, coaching, making sure that students are getting everything they need from higher education, and that everything is staying student-centered so we can assist them in those systemic barriers and overpowering.
Awesome. So today we're actually going to be talking about traditional university settings, right? I have been a part of a lot of parent and guardian comms flows and comms strategies and brand strategies. And in my experience, sometimes like that family communications can be treated as like an afterthought or a barrier like to manage, right? So it's like, we got to talk to the helicopter mom. We got to talk to the meandering granddad. But what I was super excited to learn, Jana, from your perspective is like Indigenous communities. And if you want to talk to Indigenous students, family communication looks and feels very different in that community. So what is like that tactical reframe of family engagement looks like when you kind of shift from, as you said, informing parents and families to including the family, inform versus include?
At most large research university settings, family engagement is treated like a logistical problem, right? Something to manage.
Mhm.
Staff send newsletters, they hold orientations, they have family weekends, and maybe they send out a survey once in a while. The only goal really is to keep parents informed. But for many American Indian and Alaska Native communities, family isn't a sidebar. It's actually at the center. So decision-making happens collectively. Families are very aware of experiences other community members might have at certain institutions, both positive and negative, and knowledge flows across the generations. And so education isn't something an individual does alone. They're really doing it for their family and for their communities. And so what other institutions can learn from the tribal colleges is to stop asking, how do we inform parents, and start asking, how do we include families? And this is really done well at TCUs. These institutions are already integral part of the community, and families are welcome, and relationships have already been established. The TCUs become a hub for community activities, and the TCU supports students and their families through meals, food drives, and other needs that they might have.
Kata, when we were kind of brainstorming about this, I know again, like student ready strategies, and when we talk about the different needs of students, what does that look like when we're talking about student bodies that have different needs in relationship to like their relationship with their parents and their families? How do you get a university student ready kind of from that perspective?
Sure. So at SRS, our vision is a world in which institutions believe every student can succeed and purposefully evolve so that they actually do. And in order
Mhm.
to do that, families have to be included. And something that TCUs do really well is they acknowledge that students have their family as co-decision makers.
Mm.
Sometimes we hear in higher education about the snowplow parents or the helicopter parents, like you mentioned. And at a TCU, what happens is family is included. And when institutions build with families instead of around them, students stand on a much more stable ground. They have that
Mm.
foundation. They're able to sit there and really have this holistic experience. And TCUs help acknowledge that family is a huge part of their identity and that it is a collectivistic culture and that going to college and attending a TCU is a family effort. So this really includes inviting families into those early conversations about admissions, financial aid, support services, student expectations, and really making sure that those policies at those institutions are infused with community initiatives because family isn't an add-on. They are part of the institutional core, and TCUs really have
Mhm.
a great model of doing that.
Yeah, and I think it's super interesting to talk about that because, we always like to talk about, meet students where they are. And it's an interesting mix because as you're going into the university setting for the first time, it's like independence. You get to be you get
Yeah.
to be away from your family. But there are so many decisions and so many things that are happening in the background where like the student isn't just standing alone kind of like on this independent journey, and especially when you all talk about like the tribal colleges where the family plays such a huge role in deciding, like your family decides whether or not you go to a certain college and what you study. So even just PWIs and even like HBCUs and MSIs can take that away because there are even still families in those communities where family is helping really make that decision. We know that parents are like some of the biggest decision factors when it comes to selecting what college you're going to go to. So, we've talked about like admissions and enrollment teams like needing to move beyond kind of that one size fits all or that mentality of like the snowplow parent or the helicopter parent when it comes to those communications. What is one tactical change that a university can make right now to better reach and build trust with those indigenous prospective students and families? Like what's one tactic is you're like, if you were to change or consider something right now that can connect back to those audiences?
I just want to mention that it's critical for colleges and universities to create genuine connections and build lasting relationships with the tribal communities that they hope to serve.
Mhm.
Without an established relationship, it's really unlikely that students or families will engage with or trust communications coming from those individuals or institutions that feel distant or unfamiliar. So, relationship building must come before recruitment. And this means showing up
Mhm.
in a good way to tribal communities, events, and activities. One way this could be done is by inviting Native educators, alumni, and students to co lead outreach and campus programming. I also think that the university should show commitment through action and resources. So, for example, supporting local college readiness program scholarships, internships within tribal communities, hosting campus visits specifically designed for Native students and their families, and including opportunities to meet Indigenous faculty and student organizations, and then sharing resources. Don't just extract
Mm.
talent, but also give back to those communities. It's really important to recognize that students rarely make these college decisions in isolation. They seek guidance from parents, extended family members, elders, and friends. And so the experiences that these trusted individuals have with the particular institutions, both positive and negative, carry tremendous weight in shaping a student's perceptions and choices. Because of this, institutions must be intentional about how they engage with, interact with, and talk about tribal communities. Every touch point, whether through marketing, materials, outreach, events, or campus visits, contributes to a broader narrative about the university's respect, authenticity and commitment. And finally, I just want to mention admissions and enrollment teams should reflect on who's doing this work. Having team members who share lived experiences with the students and communities being served helps ensure that the communication is culturally grounded, empathetic, and relevant. A diverse team not only strengthens outreach, but it also signals to prospective students and families that they are seen, heard, and valued within that institution.
And I think we talked a little bit about this as we kind of prep for this episode too, Kata. Like, we have so many universities that operate without real understanding of like
Yeah.
those tribal practices. And like one of the best examples you gave me was like you have students that stop out or that have a high absence rate because they have mandatory attendance
Mm-hmm.
for certain ceremonies and things like that, and that doesn't ever really reflect well on like the traditional one size fits all, this is the attendance policy, which actually starts to isolate groups. So how do you talk to campus leaders, kind of like building on what Jana said, like you want to have that understanding, you want to have the communications, you want to understand the lived experience. Where does a campus leader start? So if I'm in enrollment, if I'm in recruitment or even marketing and I say, well, I want to tell these stories authentically, and like Jana said, like you've got to do the community building first before you ask, hey, come to our college or come to our university. You've got to build the relationship first. Where does someone start with that journey pretty authentically without just like popping in and say, hey, here's some flyers, we'd love to talk to you? What's the most authentic way to start that relationship?
I would say that cultural integration is a policy decision, and TCUs prove that when culture guides strategy, students thrive. And I think that's something that's really important to keep in mind because I will hype up. I will be Jana's hype person and add on to what she said.
Whoop, whoop.
In the way, yes, I say I am a hype person on top of being in a director of post-secondary strategy, adding that to my resume. So for me, I really think something that Jana hit on highly is aligning communication timelines with tribal calendars, for example. That is a great way
Mm.
to build community because you're not expecting the TCU to teach you. You are going in and you are doing your own research. There are TCUs in so many different states in this country, and they can be right in another institution's backyard and they would never know it. So, doing your own homework and making sure that you are figuring out who is in your backyard, who is on this land, whose land is it that your institution is on or next to, and making sure that you're aligning with tribal calendars. Because when you do that, it shows that you are actually culturally invested and that you
Yeah.
actually acknowledge that this is important and that it is an integral part of the student experience. I would also say sending information in multiple formats is a great way to meet TCU students where they're at because we have become a very digital society, especially after COVID. So there is a lot of emailing, but that community connection is so important. So there are folks who really would appreciate a letter in the mail. There are folks that appreciate a phone call because when you do that very personalized outreach, it shows that you have done your research on what is valued, especially with TCUs. And so many of the community cultures are about oral traditions, oral history, having that personalized connection, really expanding to make that personal connection from the bat so that these students know, hey, I have an option if I do want to transfer. And to
Yeah.
continue on to Jana's importance of family as well, if an auntie says that they had a bad experience or a good experience at an institution, that's going to really tell a student where their next step is. So
Yeah.
that is also integral. Understanding that importance of conversation really loops around. So if I am somebody who has an auntie who had a great experience at your four-year institution, I'm probably going to go there, and other folks in my community may go there. And there's also the flip side to that. So I think it really reminds us that TCUs have this strength and that they really value that community. And that is such a high foundation for them. And having it infused in policy just goes such a long way in what they can teach mainstream institutions as well.
Yeah. And it's super interesting because those even just sound like great. Like if you apply those things, those are great practices for anybody. Like being
Exactly.
able to look at certain calendars and certain groups and when decisions are being made versus like again this one size fits all when we know hyper personalization is so important for enrollment funnels these days. So one of my favorite things that you all talk about is like when you design systems that support Indigenous students, everyone benefits. Can you share a few of the examples, tactics, or programs that started as kind of like an Indigenous inclusion effort, but then was improved things for outside audiences as well?
Yeah, I think one of the things I think about is just policies. I've worked at both a 2-year campus and a 4-year university, and you got to have policies. You got to have clear expectation.
Policies,
I
boo.
know. I think what's cool about tribal colleges is they have policies, but they're flexible and not overly restrictive. And so I think that is one thing that other schools could learn about how to design policy that takes into lots of different things into account when they're thinking about you want certain things to happen, but you need to be somewhat flexible because everyone has different needs. And so the other thing to think about as people think about, inclusion efforts and those kinds of things is students need to belong and feel important among the campus community. So policies that don't take into account culture or ceremony norms tend to
Mhm.
be a huge barrier and challenge to students from Native communities. I also think institutional policies tend to focus on the business side of the college or university. And I know that they're designed to control or prevent certain behaviors, and they tend to have this really negative consequence. However, what would happen if institutions focused on students and created more adaptable policies that consider exceptions and alternative options? So those are the kind of the
Mhm.
flexible policy things I think about that I think the TCUs do really well.
And as we think about someone's listening to this podcast and they're like, man, I want to learn more about this. Like, this intrigues me. There's probably so many teachings and learning, even like you said, Jana, some of the policies. Where can they find this information? Like, who can they reach out to? Where can they, do research and figure out what next steps to take if they want to include Indigenous values and enrollment and recruitment? Where do they start?
I mean, I think one place they can start is really looking at their own backyards and seeing what tribal communities are there, because I think it's really important for mainstream higher ed to understand that designing for Indigenous students doesn't create niche systems, it creates
Mhm.
better systems. TCUs do this better than any place that I've ever seen. They have an empathy driven practice. And when empathy is a professional expectation, all students benefit, everybody does. And so they show that when we build for the margins, we strengthen the entire center. And I think that's really important, especially because sometimes I think in mainstream higher ed, there's a lot of competition. And
Yes.
so, whereas TCUs are very collaborative, they work well
Mhm.
together. They very much learn from one another. It is a cross collaborative framework. And so, I think it's really important to remember that because there's also a lot of expertise at these institutions. So, I encourage folks not only just to look at who is nearby, but also when they're going to conferences, because we know higher ed is the Oprah of conferences. You get a conference and you get a conference, everybody gets a conference. So,
And
being
acronyms and conferences. That's what higher ed loves. We get like 50 a year.
Exactly. And so, with all of that said, being able to look and see what TCU folks are presenting, what can I learn from them? AIHEC has a ton of resources on their website. There's so many different ways to get involved. And I think even too, with the different knowledge communities that, like NASPA, ACPA have. And I think sometimes, again, going back to that community centered practice, I
Mhm.
think sometimes we lose because we're so used to emailing folks or being on a screen that you really can contact a TCU and say, hey, I am really struggling with, for example, reinterpreting higher ed jargon, because TCUs do that very well. They take the jargon and they write it for their students to make sure that everybody knows what they're talking about. You can easily read a TCU policy or procedure and know what's going on and what it means. And so if that's something that you want to work on, reach out, because folks want to teach, they want to share their knowledge, and really recognizing that TCUs are a wealth of, research, evidence-based practices, experts both in faculty and practitioner work, and making sure that that is not forgotten about, especially because sometimes, because there is a small amount folks think of them, they don't always think about where they are. So definitely utilizing them as experts and making sure that they know that TCUs are great at using research, but adapting it so that the model really becomes perfect for their students.
Perfect. Well, thank you all for joining us today. These are really great tactics. Again, being able to bring those Indigenous student values into your enrollment and recruitment strategies. And you heard it here, lead with empathy and win over the aunties. So keep remembering to walk the walk and talk the tactics. We'll see you next time. Thanks for listening to Talking Tactics. If you want to try out the tactics you heard on today's show, you get a full 10 from me, and I would love to hear about how you made them your own. You can find me by searching Safaniya, Safaniya, on LinkedIn. There's not many Safaniyas on there, so you'll be able to see me. And if you're enjoying Talking Tactics, please rate and review the show. The overachiever in me needs your feedback, and I'll certainly use it for confirmation or, optimization, depending on the review. And finally, if you just can't get enough great podcasts, the Enrollify Podcast Network delivers with an amazing selection of other marketing and admissions-based podcasts just for you. Visit Enrollify.org and subscribe for all the latest details and content drops directly to your inbox. Enrollify is brought to you by Element 451, the digital workforce platform for higher ed. Learn more at element451.com. See you next time.